Fort Ann's a small community in upstate New York, the real upstate New York, not 100 miles out of New York City. Deep in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, the community was forged through the hard-fought skirmishes of the Revolutionary War. Two forts were in the area, Fort Schuyler and the Queen's Fort. The name Anne in Fort Anne came from Queen Anne. A battle was actually fought in Fort Anne against the British Army. The town never gained any kind of traction as being a popular place to be in terms of raising kids, building businesses, or realizing dreams. It was just Fort Anne. However, if you wanted to be a big fish in a small pond, it was a perfect place to be. The town had one bank, one convenience store, one church, and one coffee shop. There was one of everything in a town that wasn't but 0.3 square miles in size with the exception of bars. It had two. One was a morning bar for those workers on a night shift at Comstock Prison and the local factories in Glens Falls. They would drink until about 12 noon, and they would all head for home to snooze it off before going back to work and doing it all over again. The other bar had normal hours for drinking, 4 p.m. to 1 a.m., and this is a place you could find anybody after dark if you wanted to meet. In the mornings, the same crowd would crawl out of bed and make their way to Finch's Cafe, where food was greasy and the coffee was hot. In 1970, the U.S. Census for Fort Anne listed 227 people. The demographics were simple. It was 99.98% Caucasian and 0.02% black. There was one black gentleman in town, and he was never treated poorly or discriminated against. As a matter of fact, he was perhaps the most popular man in town. His name was Charlie, and he was the plumber. He seemed to be able to fix anything. His wife had died 4 years earlier, so he was often at the coffee shop getting breakfast, but he never went to the bars. He spent his nights at the church playing piano and singing hymns. He also organized the Christmas Eve sing-along in the town square. Sheriff Jones was holding court at the large round table by the front door of Finch's Cafe so everybody could see him when they came in. It was, after all, an election year, and the last thing he needed was some do-gooder thinking they could take away a job he had held for the last 20 years. The sheriff before him was his father, and the sheriff before him was Sheriff Jones' grandfather. It was a family thing. The only thing remarkably different about the sheriff from previous family law enforcement officers was the fact that he had seen the film Cool Hand Luke in 1967, and for some strange reason he started talking with a fake southern accent. He'd call many a man good old boy and many a woman darling, and he was fond of saying, "What we have here is a failure to communicate," which was right out of the movie. But he said it like this: "What we have here is a failure to communicate." But still, Sheriff Jones was well loved and respected by everyone in the community, despite his comical episodes and his secret desire his whole life to be a showman. Drama was his middle name. His stories were legendary. One time when Sheriff Jones was a child, he was known by everyone as Johnny. Johnny decided to build rocket propulsion for his bicycle. He was about 10 years old at the time. He had found a homemade recipe for explosives in an old book in his aunt's house on Lombard Street in Hudson Falls. It was as neatly typed as you would expect from an old carriage typewriter, and it had a handwritten note on it that said, "This really packs a wallop." Johnny liked the sound of that. He went down to the local feed and grain store and picked up all the necessary ingredients. The shopkeeper said the last time he had sold this list of items, it was to Mr. Grubway, who said something about those darn beavers, or beavers building a dam. Either way, he asked Johnny if his parents were helping him with his project. Since Johnny's dad was the sheriff, he was cut a substantial amount of slack. Johnny lied and said everybody was involved with it. Once Johnny got back to the barn behind his house, he found an old lab jacket and some goggles. He measured and poured items from one container to another. He stirred and stirred until everything looked just right. He found some old tin pipes about 4 inches wide and 2 feet long. He screwed one on each side of his bicycle. He carefully poured the powdery mix into the end of the pipe, and he screwed an end cap on with some sharp, tiny screws. He cut his finger on one screw, and the red blood trickled down his finger. Johnny laughed. He thought it was a small price to pay for the show he was about to put on for the kids around the neighborhood. He added more powder, and then he rammed old newspaper into the tubes to pack it as tight as possible. He then capped the remaining end, drilled a hole in the top of the pipe, and pushed a simple fuse down into the container. He did the same thing on the other side. When he finished, he stepped back to look at his work. It looked good, but this was a show, and it needed something extra. He found some yellow paint and painted the cans as bright as possible. After it dried, and it seems like it took forever, 2 hours. He then took red paint and made some very fancy flames shooting down the cans. It looked spectacular. At least to Johnny it did. There was still something missing, though. Oh, he knew what it was. Glitter. He made the glue transparent and wet on the sides of the flames and added lots of glitter. It was now perfect. Johnny ran inside and put together a poster advertising the event. Surely this town would be willing to pay to see an event of this caliber. He knew some folks didn't have a whole lot of money, and he would be outside, so he decided to accept donations. He would tell them a portion of the proceeds would be going to charity. The charity was his Sweet Tooth Fund, his Sizzler collection, and his new BB gun he was getting soon. It was a non-profit organization solely dedicated to making Johnny very happy. Johnny's crayons were in an old cigar box. He took them out and wrote in big letters on the poster paper left over from a failed science fair the previous year. Ladies and gentlemen, come see the amazing Johnny Jones and his powerful rocket bike this Saturday, Main Street and 5th, 12 noon. Donations will be accepted. The big day came, and as Johnny walked his bike down Ash Street towards Main, the kids seemed to come out of the woodwork. They followed him as if he were as big as the Beatles, or better yet, Evel Knievel. The turnout for Fort Anne was huge. Even adults brought some lawn chairs, and one kid was benefiting from the activity by selling lemonade for inflated prices down by the Morgan oak tree. Johnny made his way to the center of the street. There was no danger of a car coming at this time of day, so he prepared himself to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, thank you for taking time to join me on this historic day. It wasn't long ago that man was only able to walk. With increases in technology, we have evolved to be able to pedal. But now, through the marvels of modern science, I, Johnny Jones, will usher in the era of rocket propulsion here in Fort Anne, New York. You and my friends will be witnesses to a great moment in a great city with great people. Everyone cheered. Johnny held his hands up to quiet them down. Furthermore, I'll be offering rides on my handlebars after the initial trip down Main Street. And there will be photographic opportunities. My cousin Elizabeth has offered her Brownie camera to help us out. All funds spent here today will remain in Fort Anne to further our fine economy. Who's ready to see some firepower? The crowd roared to life. People chanted Johnny's name. He was elated. How could anyone imagine how he felt? He was king of the mountain. For once he had arrived. Johnny positioned the bike so it pointed dead center down the road. There could not be any miscalculations on this historic moment. He put his hand up to feel the wind. Some people in the crowd did the same thing. Johnny licked his finger and pointed in the wind. So did everyone else. Johnny got off the bike. Everyone gasped. They thought he'd chickened out. But Johnny walked about 20 paces down the road, picked up a twig, and threw it aside. Feeling confident the road was clear, he walked back and mounted his chariot of glory. The chrome reflected the sunlight perfectly. The paint job was without blemish. Johnny wore a white t-shirt with a white cape. His jeans were rolled at the bottom, and he wore black leather boots. Johnny looked at the girl in the crowd, and he thought she blew him a kiss. He winked at her. She swooned. There was magic in the air. You could feel it. Johnny fumbled with the matches in his pocket for a second, but he got one out. He made one fuse longer than the other so they would set the rockets off at exactly the same time. This was real science. He was a modern-day Da Vinci. He yelled out, "Today we make history. What happens here today will change the world." The crowd roared its approval. History was made. Johnny gripped the handlebars of his bike and waited for the rush of power, but it never happened. People still talk about where they were when the great flash of Fort Anne occurred. The local veterans of World War II say the explosion that occurred that day in Fort Anne was far bigger than any they had ever seen in combat. 4 people still say they lost their hearing that day. One man claimed to be blind, but nobody believed him, especially since he could be found at a bingo parlor every Friday in Glens Falls. When the smoke cleared, all anybody could see was Johnny running down the street, trying to put his butt out because it was really on fire. The shock of it all was lessened when someone in a group of people left behind said, "Good thing he didn't eat a second helping of beans last night at Finch's Cafe. Could have been much worse." Everybody had a good laugh and went home. Time heals all wounds, even burnt tissue and homemade gunpowder on your rear. Most people had forgot that day, and Johnny Jones was a lot bigger, stronger, and more powerful now, so mentioning the past was not a good idea.